There's a big piece of legislation on the agenda when the House of Commons resumes this week. The Fed's long-awaited online harms bill is set to be introduced Monday. Again, the first version of the bill was tabled in 2019 and criticized for being too wide in scope, opening the government up to accusations of censorship. This version, the Prime Minister insists, will focus on kids' safety. The Tories say they won't support the bill.
I point out the irony that someone who spent the first half of his adult life as a practicing racist, who dressed up in hideous racist costumes so many times he says he can't remember them all, should then be the arbiter on what constitutes hate.
Mr. Poilievre hasn't even seen the legislation we're about to put forward next week. He's already telling people exactly what it is and what it isn't.
Our Sunday strategy session is here to dig into all of that. Corey tonight was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former Director of Communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Scott Reid is a former Communications Director to Prime Minister Paul Martin, and Tom Mulcair is a former leader of the NDP. Hi, everybody. It's nice to see you. Let's start on the online harms bill. Scott, the government this week and the Prime Minister specifically seemed to say, narrow the scope very sharply. This will be about kids' safety. Do you think that is in an effort to blunt some of the criticism that the bill endured in previous iterations?
Well, I hope it's in part to make it good legislation. Any parent who's got a kid with a phone knows that this is a real issue. You know, mental health advocates, educators, parents, we know this is an issue. It really is. You know, kids are getting trolled. There are untold stories of kids being, harmed online, and the effect of it is felt by families right across the country. So I hope that the legislation is improved. I hope that it would be narrowed, and I hope that the focus will mean that it will pass and will actually have a positive impact, because people that traffic in this stuff should be held to account in the most severe way possible. And that's why, politically, I know that the Conservatives think right now they can just hurl any insult they want at Trudeau, that he's low in the polls and low in popularity and they're bulletproof. But I really question whether they are on the right side of this. Their message is 100% clear. It isn't that they are for free speech. It's that they are for consequence-free speech. Rather than these kids that we're talking about, Poilievre is telling people he'd rather protect 3 degenerate dorks in their basement who want to make 10 grand a month by YouTubing garbage, misinformation, and lies. I think that's a wrong place to be. People know that harm occurs online. They know that people need to be fenced in. And he can talk all he wants about gatekeepers and racism, but Poilievre hasn't even seen the legislation, which means he just doesn't give a damn about the issue.
Corey, how do you interpret it? And what do you think the strategy is behind Poilievre making his initial criticism so personal in nature?
It's a play that he's used a number of times in terms of a defense against an attack that Liberals have made against Conservatives many times over the years in Canadian politics, where they've alluded that there's some sort of racist element to conservatism, which I got to say, as somebody who's been involved in the Conservative Party for my whole career, I've yet to see. And so I think it's a counterpunch, in anticipation of a tried and true Liberal attack line. I think in terms of him talking about the legislation before having seen it, I think that's just smart politics in terms of framing an issue, and everybody does it. I don't think there's anything particularly novel in that. But I think how he's framing it speaks to a truth that, I know Scott disagrees with, but I think a lot of Canadians agree with Poilievre on this, that they don't want to have, one segment of Canadian society making decisions around content for everybody else, especially, in an increasingly polarized world. They don't want to have, essentially liberals and liberal bureaucrats making these decisions on what constitutes acceptable speech.
Yeah, I think more generally where Corey's coming from, Tom, when it comes to larger issues of kind of regulating the online space. But if in fact this bill does zero in specifically on children and kids' safety, does that become a bit harder or more politically challenging of an argument to make?
Well, that's why it is important to actually read this statute. Let's go back to the tragic death of Rehtaeh Parsons. I remember Peter MacKay, then Attorney General, brought in some really strong legislation that sought just to do that, help protect kids, and it was supported on all sides. So here we have a completely different backdrop to the discussion. This week, the attack against Trudeau by Poilievre involving the whole issue of blackface being brought back up, that was echoed by no less a figure than Elon Musk. I mean, that's serious stuff politically. So that's the backdrop here. Poilievre has his lines really well prepared. His best, as far as I'm concerned, is for Trudeau, hate speech is any speech that he hates. And he's trying to frame it that way. Trudeau's trying to decide for us what we're allowed to say and, of course, hear. I think that Scott's point is the one that we're going to be hearing a lot from the Liberals this week. This is about protecting kids from harm. And if it stays on that and it's irrefutable and there's very little wiggle room for Poilievre to get back in on his main lines, I think that Trudeau will win the day.
Is there a risk, if the legislation is broader in scope, Scott, to have the Conservatives punch through on some of what Corey was talking about?
Sure, there is. And so we'll have to see what the content of the legislation is. The Liberals would be awfully unwise to not narrow it very rigorously, particularly after they've signaled that that's what they're going to do. But, I'll go a step further politically. Even if they do narrow it, the truth is that Poilievre may well get away with this. It may not take him politically. That's kind of the rhythm we're in here, in terms of where popular opinion resides, the degree of engagement that you're getting from Canadians. But this is a challenge, and where I think that the Trudeau Liberals can make some ground is highlighting and echoing the problem, not as some gatekeeper bureaucrats from Ottawa, but rather as parents.
Does Poilievre, Corey, have to come up, if in fact it is this narrow, does he have to come up with a response? If we're not going to support this legislation and we don't think the government is the arbiter, here's how we would keep kids safe? Because does he risk kind of being framed as what Scott talked about, like not caring about the issue?
Well, I'm not sure what the policy solution on this problem is, and I think it'd be a struggle for anyone to articulate one that withstands much scrutiny at all. Look, a lot of these things are just a function of changing technology, and no piece of legislation is going to clean up the cesspool that is social media. If it were as easy as passing a bill, then a bill would have been passed a long time ago.
Tom, what do you think about that? I mean, essentially, it boils down to a debate over whether or not the government can effectively combat the mess that we see online, if that is the tool to do so.
Well, if that's the standard, then it's a very high bar, because, of course, whether or not you're going to be successful depends on how it rolls out and how it's greeted. I go back to what was already done by Harper at the time. It was met with approval across society. I'm not of an age to have children in high school, but I've got grandchildren in high school, and I see the omnipresence of those social media in their lives. They wake up with it, they go to sleep with their phone. It's something that's a new phenomenon in our society, and I think that Scott is largely right on this. We've got to be listening to parents who are saying, okay, we've tried, we've done what we can. Is there any way you can help us put a filter on some of this so that the most harmful stuff doesn't make it through?
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. Scott Reed, Corey Tenike, and Tom Mulcair, our Sunday strategy session.